Okay, on to our next unit. This one is on aquatic and terrestrial pollution. And we're going to start with sources of pollution. And it may not be what you're thinking. When we talk about sources of pollution, we're not talking about uh, the facilities that manufacture the pollution, where it came from. Instead, we're just talking about how we would identify where it came from. And basically, that means it comes down to two different things. There are what we call point sources of pollution and non point sources of pollution. It really has to do with about identifying where the pollution came from, how it got into the environment. So let's just start with a point source. So the EPA, that's the American government's uh, environmental police agency, if you will. They define a point source as being any source of pollution or contaminant that can be traced back to a point of origin, to a confined place where we can say it came from here. And that basically comes out to like smokestacks, discharge pipes, and drainage ditches. So if we can trace it to a certain place, a point source, then we can say you're the person responsible for it. You have to pay to clean it up, and you have to pay any penalties associated with the harm that you've caused to other people and to the environment. So let's just look at a few examples. Obviously, smokestacks. So we can look and say, you know what, all that pollution, all that say sulfur dioxide and mercury is coming from right there. The person who owns this, they're going to pay for it. All right. Another one is discharge pipes. These used to be more common than they are now, but used to be, factories that were generating toxic could just dump it out into the nearest river or creek or drainage ditch and be done with it. So if upstream from here the water was clear and downstream it's all polluted, we can say, well, here it is. It's coming out of here. We follow this pipe back. Whoever owns that factory is going to have to pay for the cleanup. Now with farms, a lot of times farms it can be difficult to say who's responsible for, say, the high nitrate or phosphate or pesticide levels in a particular body of water. But if we can trace the drainages back to one person's farm, let's say this drainage ditch has a lot of pesticides and nitrates in it, and the same person owns both sides of it, and when you get upstream from them, the drainage ditch above their property doesn't have it, but everything down from it does, that's a point source, and that person is going to be liable to pay for it. Now, you may not have given much thought to this, but municipal governments can also discharge point source pollution from sewers. So, like as I said, you don't really know how to think about this, but when you flush a toilet, the brown water, as it's called, so the water that's contaminated with feces and urine and other things, it goes down, it drops into a pipe that's got a little bit of an angle to it. This is an exaggerated angle, but basically it's going to flow downhill to a sewage treatment plant that's then going to treat it using bacteria and filters and gravels and make it so that the water that comes out is no longer harmful. But what happens is normally it comes down and it reaches this little place inside the sewer system that acts as a barrier, so it can't keep going downstream, and then it's redirected to go to the sewage treatment plant. But what happens is when there's a large weather event, so we have roofs are draining down into the downspout, we have streets are draining, all this impervious surface has to go somewhere. It goes into these shared sewage pipes that have both brown water, but they also have storm water. And what happens is during the storm events, a lot of times it will overflow, and then that outflow will be a point source of fecal contamination. Sometimes these facilities just get overrun with water, and they just have to discharge directly. So sometimes these sewage treatment facilities themselves just discharge, and they become a point source. And if you're not using a municipal waste treatment facility, then hopefully you have what's called a septic system, which is what my home in Washington has. And basically, it's just like a miniature version of a municipal sewage treatment facility. It just happens in your backyard using anaerobic bacteria and gravel beds. But if something was to go wrong and you're no longer completely mitigating the fecal material before it gets out into your yard, then you start having all these excess nutrients. You have bacteria getting into the environment. And then if that gets out of your yard into a nearby stream and authorities notice this problem and they trace it back to your house is that point source. And here's a classic one. So underground storage tanks. So gasoline service stations often have these, and sometimes you also have these for we'll talk about in a later screencast about storing uh, toxic waste. But you have underground storage facilities that are made out of steel or iron, and they corrode, and they start to leak into the groundwater. Now, with gasoline being a hydrocarbon is nonpolar, and it's also volatile, which means it evaporates. So it'll often first gets noticed because people start to smell it. That might accumulate in people's basements and even cause their houses to explode. Uh, it gets into the water, and a little bit of it can dissolve, even though it's not polar, it can dissolve into the water. Once it gets in the groundwater, we got a real problem because these things are carcinogens. And again, so when a governmental organization notices a problem, they smell it or they detect somehow in water, they can trace it back to this point source. And Chuckles here has got a lot of liability on the line there. Now, non-point sources are really more of a problem in a way because you can't point to who's responsible. This is when the problem is diffuse over a large area and there's multiple contributors, and we can't really say who's responsible for it. So that's what we call a non-point source pollution. And this is a little bit more difficult to mitigate because you can't just point to one party. You can't impose the threat of penalties on an individual like you can with point source. And so it becomes more of a societal problem that requires uh, a different mindset for how to treat it, which is basically managing whatever it is that the person, either through education or through trying to manage whatever effluent it is, say from car exhaust. So let's just take a look at examples. Uh, uh, Urban runoff, and suburban runoff. So when it rains, people's yards have pesticides, they have herbicides, they have fertilizers, they have animal waste. All that stuff from all the houses ends up going into the street drains and out into the environment, and it's just coming from everywhere at once. And so you can't pin it on any one particular person, but it adds a lot of contaminants to our aquatic ecosystems. Another one is farms. We've talked about this a lot, but farmers use fertilizers, they use pesticides. There's nutrients from manures that get spread out, and if there's one drainage ditch coming out of one farm, like I say, this farmer is the one who's causing the problem. Fine, that's the point source. But usually that's not the case. Usually, you got all these farms contributing, and so we have this problem. Our water just has a lot of phosphate in it. Our water has a lot of nitrate. Water has a lot of pesticides and herbicides. And we don't, I mean, like they're all contributing. Everybody's contributing a little bit and it adds up to a lot. That's non-point source. One that we encounter here in our city is air pollution. So all these AQI pollutants are mostly coming out of, well, a lot of them are coming out of cars. And so there's a whole lot of cars. So each driver is a little bit responsible for this problem. So it's spread out over the entire urban area. And the best way to deal with that is to just say we have emission controls. If you have a car, you have to have it checked to see how much pollution it's making. If you're making too much as an individual, you have to remediate your one particular car. When it comes to things like urban, and suburban fertilizers and pesticides, that just comes down to education. You just have to educate people on what not to do and hope they'll do the right thing. And what you may not have thought about is pharmaceuticals. If you go to the doctor and the doctor says you need to take antibiotics, or you need to take cholesterol medicine, antidepressants, birth control, whatever it is, a lot of it just passes right through your body, and it just gets out it goes out through your waste, through your urine, your feces, and it ends up in the ecosystem, and it's coming from all over the place. Most people at some point in life are going to be taking medicine. So all over the world, these pharmaceuticals are draining out of people's houses and into the environment. So they're coming from all over. All right, so that's point source and non-point source. I don't know how this turned out. I'm having to use a different computer, and I can't see myself, so I don't know if I was on screen or not. Let's see how I did. Doesn't seem to turn off as easy.